to the SAGE Applied Research webinar series, where we focus on issues related to farm stress. And we're really grateful for y'all's attendance today. And we're also very appreciative of Dr. Emily Paskowitz from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, Associate Professor of Communication Studies in the School of Communication Studies and Department of Agricultural Leadership, Education, and Communications, for sharing her wealth of information on this important topic today of family farm stress and coping. Having said that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Paskowitz.
Well, awesome. Thank you all for being here today. Even though I can't see your smiling faces, I'm glad to know that you're here on the webinar with us. And I'm really excited to share some of the research that I've been working on with my colleagues, Dr. Laura Miller here in the School of Communication Studies, as well as Victoria or Tori Bertram, who's one of our doctoral candidates getting ready to finish up her dissertation. And all of us come from farm backgrounds of some sort. I grew up on a dairy farm in Minnesota. Laura grew up in a crop farm family in Illinois, and Tori grew up surrounded by farms in Western Kentucky. And so all three of us have been excited to work on this project and start to explore some of the dynamics around family farm stress and coping. And this comes from both Laura and I have backgrounds studying family farms. And so we dove into that specific aspect. And so what really interested us was getting into some of the dynamics related to family farms. Now, most of this is familiar to us. Oh, there we go. That in the United States, 96% of the total farms are considered family farms, which the USDA defines as any farm organized as really the sole ownership by a family. There's not a corporation, there's not hired managers, there's not a lot of outside contact. It is really truly a family farm. And these count as about 96% of farms in the US as of 2017. What's more interesting is if you look into some of the family business literature, family farms are 5 times more likely to be passed on to the next generation than any other type of family business. And so we're really looking at institutions here that have this long legacy of farming within the family. And then finally, as most of us know, there is a huge critical stabilizing impact on the economy from family farms. In rural areas, farms tend to provide employment for people in the community, and they also provide support for the community and are an economic resource for more rural parts of the United States. So in light of this, family farms look wonderful, but we also know that there are challenges, and these aren't necessarily unique. I think these face all farms. First off, we know in the last 50 years, the United States has lost 1 million family farms. And this was according to the latest USDA Census of Agriculture. We also know that only 33% of family farms make a profit or even break even by the end of the year. And so that leaves over, well, 7% or so that are financially struggling. And finally, we also know for farmers overall that they're at 1.5 to 2 times the suicide rate of the general population. And so there's definite and obvious struggles going on for farmers overall, and especially family farms, as we've seen this drop in farm and the lower profits. And so what was interesting to us was to start to dive into what is going on in family farms, and specifically around farm stress, which is part of this SAGE network of grants. And so to do that, we used a framework familiar to us in our communication field called the stress and coping framework. And what it does is it tries to explain how stress and coping are linked events. So for example, if we walk through the basics of the model, events happen in our everyday life. You forget your cell phone at home. You left the keys on the counter and now can't get into your office. These events happen to us, and they can have positive or negative outcomes for us. But most of the time, these events, we look at them, we appraise the situation and go, okay, I can go without my cell phone for a day and I can manage. But if these events continue to happen, if these events start to pile up, there tend to be more of them, and we don't know how to manage them, we don't know how to resolve them, that's where stress comes in. And so in this framework, stress is defined as an individual's perception that they lack the needed resources to manage the challenges and the stressors in their environment. So anytime we're dealing with stress within this model, we're looking at the situation and going, I don't have the resources to deal with this, and now I don't know what to do. And it's this point of just anxiety and I don't have the ability to manage this and I don't know what to do about it. And so even though we are managing stress, and a lot of them, they're smaller events through the day, when family farms experience stress, it tends to be due to this lack of resources to manage the stress. And these resources could be a variety of things. It could be the lack of information or the lack of knowledge and skills in managing the situation. But it could also be the lack of financial resources, the lack of time, or any other pieces that prevent the farmer from being able to manage the stress that's in front of them. Now, interestingly, within this model, when Lazarus and Folkman presented it, they focused on very short-term stressors, i.e., an event happens, we appraise it as stressful because we don't have the resources to deal with them, but eventually in time, we will get the needed resources, it will be resolved, and it will be all better and a wonderful day. And so it focuses on this short-term stress. But when we turn to the family farm and the farm environment in general, we know that this stress looks different. So these two main stressors we highlighted from the farm literature. So this is a little bit broader than just family farms. But we know that stress is not a short time situation for farmers in today's world. And it tends to be more of a continuous battle. And these are two key factors that play into that. Number one, stress tends to be a long-term issue. We have the common stressors for farmers, of course, the weather, natural disasters, financial markets, and those things that very commonly cause stress in any time you talk to a farmer. Trust me, I visit with enough of them. But what also goes on in the family aspect is that this stress can pass down from generation to generation to generation. For example, when we see how our parents manage stress and how they respond to the situations of the farm, we then internalize, oh, this is how I'm supposed to respond when stress comes up. And so it creates these generational chains of stress throughout the family generations that then almost carry the stress forward. Now, secondly, we also know from past research that stress for farmers is largely uncontrollable and unresolvable. The stressors that the farming community are dealing with are out of their control. No farmer I've met has figured out how to control the weather yet. They're smart enough to figure out how, but they haven't figured it out yet. And so they're in this spot where I can't control the weather, I can't control the financial markets, and if we're going to get an outbreak of swine flu or avian flu or some other wide range disease, and instead, farmers are sitting here seeing all of the work they put in, all of the time and all of the effort they put into the farm, and yet it can be gone in an instant. It's completely out of their control and their work effort. And these make stress, of course, unique for farms, as most of us on here recognize. And so the question becomes, how do we cope with this? How do we manage this stress that comes up? And when Lazarus and Folkman talk about coping, it's any technique we use to manage stress. Could be a variety of things, but most of the time it happens through communication, through talking to others. And think of yourself. You're stressed out. Let's say you're working on a big project. You don't know what to do. You go and visit with someone else for some ideas. And even if they don't have any ideas, you get maybe some sympathy or empathy from them. That communication process helps you feel a little bit better about the stress. It gives you some of that emotional support. And so when we think about coping, we often go to the problem-solving side of coping. Great, I have a problem in front of me, now I need to solve it. But for farmers, they can't solve the financial market and they can't solve the weather. So instead, we were interested in looking at how are farmers responding to stress and coping and what are they actually using, which really leads to what we were interested in for this project. What are the challenges that these family farm members face? Largely getting an update in the 21st century, given the literature throughout history has been fairly consistent. But then also, how do family farm members cope with the challenges and stress that they're facing? What are they doing right now? Because we're guessing that they're doing something. And so we're interested in seeing what. And so what we did for this project is we interviewed 26 farmers in the Sage region of the United States. So this includes any farm in the southeastern part of the United States, apart from a few who were outside of that, but still were interested in the project. Interestingly, our typical participant were actually female farmers who were around 31 years old, but had been involved with the farm for an average of 21 years. So people who from very young age have been actively involved in the farm. Most of these farmers were crop or livestock farmers, but they all came from multi-generational farms. In fact, we had a few participants that came from farms that had been in the family for 6 or 7 generations. And so these are long-term family farms. Now, to briefly talk about those challenges, nothing surprising to, I think, any of us here. Environmental situations cause stress and financial situations cause stress. When we talked about environmental stressors, the participants talked a lot about how they couldn't control the weather, they couldn't control the disease that comes to the animals, and one of them noted how you can lose everything in an instant regardless of how much work you put into it. Secondly, we of course had those financial stressors, those unpredictable markets. One person shared, all that glitters isn't gold. Look at the long term. You can sell your dirt and make some money, but the rewards don't come in the form of a paycheck. I think if you look at what the ancillary benefits are, raising children and just becoming a better person. And so many of these farmers recognize that, hey, financial stress is there, but this quote kind of led us to how they are actually coping. And what these farmers are doing is, rather than focusing in on these problems and the stressors, they're reframing to a different issue or to a different topic, let's say. And so we noticed that farmers, when faced with stress, would refocus or reframe their attention to family, to nature, and to identity. And this is where I want to highlight some of the things that these farmers are doing. So in this reframe to family process, what family farmers were doing were really going back to the legacy of the farm, the heritage, the loyalty, and their roots, and how connected they are to their family and to their ancestors through owning and being a part of this farm. This quote on the screen is actually one of our favorites from the interviews. The individual shared, "You have this land that's passed down from families to families, farms that your grandfather worked. That means something to me. You don't let something like that go. You can't. That's irreplaceable, and money can't buy it." And so for a lot of these family farmers, in spite of the stress from the financial situation or from the more environmental situation, they've instead turned their attention to the fact that I'm with family. This is my grandfather's land, and they really tied back to the family connections that they experienced while being a part of the farm. Now, additionally, other participants talked about reframing and refocusing on nature. In fact, we absolutely loved it. We still throw this term around with our team, the idea of tractor therapy, which I've not figured out how to bring to UT yet, but I'd love to. And this wonderful woman that we talked to shared, "I enjoy being around the animals, and it's therapeutic for me to be out on a tractor. Your mind can rest. When you're out, and especially on a tractor, there's such a thing as tractor therapy. There really, really is." And so for farmers who talked about reframing to nature, they talked about how even though nature could be stressful, weather could come through. We heard stories of crops being destroyed, of barns burning down, and all of those stressors. But they also saw that nature was a great way to cope. Having the dirt in their hands, the same dirt that their family had, being able to raise crops or raise animals from birth to maturity, and seeing the work that they put into that. All of these pieces highlighted how they looked at nature as a key part of helping them cope, where yes, there were these stressors, but it was also a way to relax and to disconnect. Another one talked about like that opportunity to disconnect from the world by returning to nature, talking about how he loved to go out and mow the yard or bush hog at the farm because it was an outlet. It was one of those good outlet hobbies. And so for farmers, even though they looked at nature as work, such as tractor therapy, such as bush hogging, it was an opportunity to disconnect from the stress and an opportunity to refocus on the good things going on. Now, finally, we also highlighted this idea of reframing to identity. And this is how we defined farmers turning back to being a farmer, being a part of the agriculture industry, and the pride and passion that comes from being a farmer and helping feed the nation. And so for these participants, they talked about how being a part of the larger agriculture industry was very important to them and almost more important than a lot of the other stressors. One participant talked about how the grass isn't greener on the other side. City life is hard too, but farming is worth it. And so a lot of them also talked about how you need to go back to why you got into the farm in the first place. When stressors got overwhelming, when stress was there on their plate in front of them and they didn't know what to do, they needed to go back to why did you start in the first place? Like this participant. Life's going to go on. So kind of step back every now and then and remember why you started. Remember what instilled that passion. Remember how much you love agriculture. And I feel like everything will work out eventually in the end. And so for these participants, it was going back to their identity as farmers, as providers, as agricultural industry members. And that brought them pride and passion and made them willing to cope with the stressors on their plate. And so really, to wrap this up and kind of bring this together, I actually put up a picture of my great-grandfather's barn on his farm in central Minnesota, and a barn that I still go to the family reunions every summer. And so what really got us excited about this project was recognizing that farmers are coping with stress already. Now, it's not necessarily that problem-focused coping that we tend to go to in the first place or think of. How do we solve the problem? How do we fix the issue? But rather their coping tends to be what we would call cognitive restructuring, or what I like to think of is focusing on the positive. So for these farmers, when stress came up, when issues came up, they took their attention and focused on what is going on that's good here. Now, it looks like it may be downplaying the stressors. And trust me, these farmers admitted to the stressors. In fact, when we asked them about encouraging young people to get into farming, they very clearly said no because of the environmental and financial stressors there. But for these farmers involved, they focused on the positive sides of farming. They looked at the family, they looked at the nature, and they looked at their identity as farmers. And so this to us was more of an emotional type of coping, is owning the stress that's there, but then looking at the positive and holding on to those positive emotions, which research says is a good step towards more problem-based coping, right? If we have the person in a spot that, hey, emotionally, I'm in a good spot, it could also lead to more coping. Now, the other piece of this that we actually want to look at going forward, of course, we don't have any information about how effective these coping techniques are for farming, but we do want to explore some of the community-based aspects of coping. For family farms, these members tend to share the problems. They are owned by the entire family and not owned by an individual farmer. And this points to the potential for more community or group-based coping, where we have an opportunity to look at the problem as ours and we can work together to resolve it, and where it removes that piece of farmers feeling isolated in their stress, but rather looking at how can they cope with the people around them and with the community. And we really think that some of the work that the grant team's doing with the support groups is going to hugely help and highlight this aspect of community-based coping, especially because there's research out of Australia showing that the higher rates of farmer suicide are not linked to depression or anxiety, but are actually linked to self-blame for the problems. And so this more community-based coping and some of the ways that these farmers have hinted at being a community, having family to turn back to, highlight some potentially positive benefits of coping going forward. And so these were some of our ideas. We, of course, want to hear your ideas too. And I think Laura and Tori are going to help with the Q&A as well. But I believe we have about 10 minutes left, and I would love to open the floor to any questions anyone has.
So I know that the way the Zoom webinar works is people will be able to put their questions. And the first one just came in, so I'm actually going to ask this, and then I also have my own question coming up in a little bit. But the first question, Emily, Laura, Tori, is: did you see gender differences in coping?
Hmm.
Well, we did, like Emily mentioned, we had actually quite a few women who were in our sample. We didn't really look at the differences in gender, but that is something that would be really interesting, I think, going forward, especially because, like I said, we had quite a few women in our sample, but we didn't look at kind of the differences there, kind of make a distinction between coping. But that's a really great idea for the future.
And I will share too that as part of this project, the quotes we pulled, I didn't necessarily identify gender there, but we also pulled some extended stories from participants, and the stories that really exemplified the reframe to family, reframe to nature were actually both from male participants. And so there was kind of this blend of both males and females using these reframing strategies. But again, the gender difference is going to be interesting to think about going forward in terms of, do the two genders cope differently, and does that change how they manage the situation?
The next question that we have in the chat, and thank y'all for that answer, it asks, do you have insights into how the families communicate with each other on the stressors coping aside from in person, i.e., do they use group messaging apps, social media, etc., on smartphones, computers? What information is that?
That's a great question. We didn't have too many people that mentioned the use of, say, apps or social media, although we did have some people say that they learned about coping and statistics kind of relating to that through social media, say Instagram posts and things like that, that they were kind of learning about some of this farmer statistics and coping and stressors through social media. But we didn't have too many people who said that they communicated about those on social media. One of the things that we did notice was that people would talk about how they communicated with their community members. So not just their family, but people maybe in their church or maybe in their community circle or cooperative group that they were a part of, that they were maybe communicating together about, say, stress and coping, and that was one way that they were talking about it beyond their family members. But we didn't really have too many people talking about apps, although that's a really great question for the future. Emily, I don't know if you had any other comments.
Yeah, the only other thought I had was, in another piece out of this project we're looking at, was we had a number of participants talk about how they feel better talking about being stressed and having maybe some down days because of social media influencers. So they talked about Derry Carey as one of the people they follow on Facebook, and Derry Carey says, "Oh, it's Mental Health Monday. Take a break for yourself or do some self-care today." And they saw that those reminders were actually helpful to remind them that there is this broader community who's also struggling, and it's okay to take a break and try to cope and find a way to manage it.
Tori, did you want to add anything to?
No, but I can handle the next questions, when the two that have popped up.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll ask them up. The first of those questions is, were there differences in coping between races in your study?
So in terms of our demographics, we had a wide range of age, and we had almost an even distribution of gender. Unfortunately, all of our farmers were white farmers. They were pretty stereotypical, the typical farmer demographic. And so we had a pretty homogenous group in terms of racial differences, but that is one thing that we are seeing in the literature popping up, talking about, what is the experience like for Black female farmers? What is the experience like for Black farmers in general? And that's becoming a really awesome area of research that we will definitely be looking into moving forward. Do you want me to go ahead and tackle the one about age, since we're talking about just general distribution of participants in terms of demographics? So we had a nice, almost even split of young farmers and older farmers. We had some students from the Institute of Agriculture here at UT that come from a family farm and are looking for how they can salvage and maintain that farm, but also then have what a lot of them talked about, like a livable income. And so we had some that were in their 20s, but then we also had some who were grandparents and great grandparents, and they were watching their grandchildren grow up on the farm. And so we had a nice distribution of ages and lived experiences.
Thank you very much, Tori, for that response to those two questions. And folks, please feel free to add into the chat or questions. We have a couple minutes left. I also had my own question that I wanted to pose to y'all, which was, in thinking about coping and strategizing, was there discussion involved of like navigating the household division of labor, navigating mixed on-farm, off-farm income, and how this could play a role in, I guess, maybe beneficial or even negative impacts to their overall well-being and stress?
So lots of pieces there, Andy, to think about in terms of this going forward, right? I'll tackle this in pieces, and I'll let Laura and Tori kind of give their insights too. One thing that stood out to us in this interview process and project were we had a number of people we visited with who were females who were owning and taking over the farm themselves. And some of them talked about, I remember this one story very vividly in my mind, where this participant had gone to a local, I think, farmers union meeting with her dad, and a gentleman came up to her dad and said, well, you've only had girls, who's going to take over the farm? And she remembers her dad standing up and kind of going, my daughters are smart enough to take over the farm, they can do it themselves. And so it was interesting how a lot of the female participants in this project who had very active roles in the farm, which was actually the majority of them, had this very strong sense of, well, yeah, I'm a woman, but I can still farm, I can still do all of this. And so kind of getting to that division of labor question, it was really interesting because a lot of the women we talked to were actively out in the farm and partially owned the cows, if not owned all of the animals there, and were responsible for them. And so it was a very active, involved, where I am part of the farm, I'm part of the team, and not as much in the, oh, I'll take care of the household and my husband or spouse goes out and takes care of the farm, which was an interesting thing to me and something to think about for describing family farms going forward, because you tend to think of family farms in those very distinct roles.
Laura, would you like to?
Sure. Yeah. One of the other things that came up that I remember pretty vividly from the interviews was that some participants did mention, kind of like what you said, Andy, having outside income besides the farm. And some of the participants did mention that maybe they had a farm, for example, but that was not their main source of income. They had a career, they had a job outside of the farm, and the farm was sort of like almost like a hobby farm, and it was something that they did to, keep it up, but it was not their main source of income. And so I remember interviewing several people who said very specifically, well, I think it would be more stressful if this was my main livelihood. And some people kind of referenced, large family farms in the Midwest that, and of course there's others too, but I remember people giving examples that, if you had a large farm and that was your main source of income, that the stressors that Emily talked about today would be heightened because that would be your main source of financials. And so some of them said, I would be more stressed, and I would be a little bit more stressed about weather. I would be a little bit more stressed about some of these things, and I might have to learn how to cope differently. But since I have a whole job outside of the farm, if those things happen, I'm still okay. And so it was almost like that was sort of how they were coping, is kind of thinking about, well, I have this other thing going on, and so it's gonna be okay anyway, which again is almost kind of like a reframing. Tori, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add.
Sure. Yeah. One of the things in relation to this question that I found particularly interesting was that a lot of the younger farmers were told by their parents that they should not go into the family farm specifically. They need to have other options in terms of providing financial support. And so a lot of the younger participants were like, this farm is really important to me, and I would love to just do this like my parents did or like my family did and maintain it. But some of their parents have said that they're not allowed to. They have to get a degree. They have to have a stable source of income. But then in terms of how they communicate about these stressors, it's pretty much the conversations were happening everywhere, as you would imagine, as messy as a family business and complicated as that is. And so there were conversations outside at the barn while they were working on something about stress and coping. And there were conversations at the dinner table about stress and coping. And it really sort of, these conversations were happening wherever just they were. And so there was an interesting, all of the conversations they talked about were happening in different places, either while they were working, while they were standing watching a barn burn down, while they were, they saw their grandfather at the dinner table after dinner by himself, just looking absolutely weary and ready to weep. And so they talked about seeing these conversations and having these conversations in a variety of contexts too, which helps kind of further blurs the boundaries between, work-life balance and family farms, but provides just that these conversations are happening in all sorts of contexts.
Thank y'all, all three of y'all. Do we have time for one last question that came in? Yeah, there was one question, and it's linked to this discussion of division of labor, and it seems to be around, how this impacts access to health insurance, and whether that came up in y'all's conversations around maybe financial strain and how they coped with that. Would y'all could elaborate on that dynamic?
So I will say that that's actually one of the future projects that we want to do with this data. So the interviews we did with our family farm members ranged from an hour to about 2.5 hours. And so we have a lot of information here, but Laura's background is health communication. And so she was interested in learning more just about how farmers manage health broadly. And so I don't believe we specifically asked about the health insurance side of things, but we did talk about health issues broadly. I do remember one participant sharing a story, and this was an individual who grew up on the farm and is now watching his dad and brother take over the farm, and was talking about how, hey, my brother doesn't qualify for health insurance and doesn't really care because the farm comes first. And they're kind of even setting aside their own physical health because the farm, the family come first. And that was one quote that just stuck out into my mind, Andy, when you threw that question out there. Was this one participant who talked about watching his family just kind of go, yeah, well, we won't worry about health insurance because we got to get the tomatoes in the ground.
Yeah, and kind of to piggyback off that, another participant didn't talk specifically about insurance, but I remember they were talking about just access in terms of proximity to hospitals or health resources. And one participant said, oh, well, if I'm going to go to that doctor, we have to drive 2 to 3 hours, take the entire day off from the farm, and we just usually don't do that. And so again, kind of putting the health side of the family and themselves sort of, on the back burner, and putting the farm first.
Well, I would really like to thank y'all for y'all's time today and putting on this webinar. I mean, considering, that statistic that was presented at the beginning, that 96% of farms are family farms, it's such a crucial and important topic, especially when accounting for all the complexity that y'all were bringing to this conversation about, the mixing of work and life that's going on. And I think, especially for myself, it was also important to hear that this sense of legacy that sometimes gets brought up as a way to cause stress is also actually operating in this coping strategy role. And so that's crucial information as we think about how to develop culturally relevant resources for farmers writ large. So I just really appreciate y'all for today. And I would also like to thank the audience for being here and joining us for the SAGE Applied Research webinar series. And I didn't know if y'all might have final comments that y'all would like to give as we close this out.
I just actually had something pop into my head, Andy, related to what you said about kind of this blending of family and farm or business at the same time. I mean, I remember this quote my dad always said, he grew up on a family farm, now runs a family farm. And his quote was always, you want to get to the end of the day and all still want to sit around the dinner table together and have dinner. And that ability, I think, is something that's unique about family farms. Even as I've done work with family businesses in general, there's something different about family farms where you are there with your family every day. You're on land that your family has owned for likely generations. And then you want to still sit down and have dinner together and not scream and bite each other's head off. And there's just some really unique things going on here that make family farms kind of this unique situation to think about in terms of stress and coping.
I think that's such a poignant point to close us out on. Thank y'all so much. I hope y'all have a wonderful rest of your day, rest of the week as we just get it kicked off. And please look out for future applied research series webinars and briefs that we'll be putting out on this crucial topic. Thank y'all. I'll have a good one.
Thanks, everybody.